How do you learn an unsymbolized thought that you have no idea that you're doing and that you don't know that other people do?
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Mind Matters. My name is Adam, and joining me today, as usual, is Luke, Harrison, and Elon. This week, we're going to be discussing a psychologist and professor of psychology at the University of Nevada in Las Vegas. His name is Russell T. Hurlburt. He is a pioneer in the investigation of inner experience, or what he calls pristine inner experiences. He is credited with inventing these beepers that allow for something that he calls descriptive experience sampling. He's written several books on psychology, including investigating inner experience, comprehending behavioral statistics. And back in 2011, he wrote a series of 7 articles discussing what he calls pristine inner experience, discussing what he means by pristine, by inner and experience, all the ways that people think they know what their internal life is like, and at the same time, how little we actually know. And he's even come up with a paradox called Jessica's paradox, where this woman named Jessica has an inner experience that has millions of different facets to it, and yet at the same time, she's not aware of any of them. And so if you were to ask her, what's your inner experience like in terms of complexity on a scale of 0 to 10, she would answer saying 0, it's not complex at all. But if she were to actually go through the process of taking a perfect snapshot of her inner experience at a random moment, she would find that her actual inner experience is possibly way more complex than she actually realizes. So that was what the series of 7 articles is about. Of course, he's also written several books that encompass the same thing, one of which I've started reading, which is pretty interesting. And I guess with that kind of an introduction, I will open up the floor and see, does anybody have anything in particular that stood out to them that they want to talk about right away?
Well, first, I'll give a little bit of background because I think what inspired you to find this guy is
Mm.
what we were talking about, like the people who lack an inner monologue, and of course this became like an internet meme. I can't remember how many years ago it was, if it was like
Hmm.
10 years ago or 8 years ago or something. I can't remember. And the whole NPC meme kind of took off after that
Yeah.
because I think it started. This might not have been the 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 absolute genesis of it, but one of them was this Reddit post, and that I read back in the day. I can't even remember it at this time, but basically someone's saying like, "Oh, you know what? There are other people there are people that hear voices in their heads. Like that's so weird." And so then, of course, all the replies are like, "What? You don't hear you don't talk in your head?" And it was just completely foreign. And then then you get like over the months, other people would come and say, "Yeah, no, I don't have a voice in my head either. That's totally weird. I thought I was normal. I thought it was just a figure of speech whenever anyone was talking about the voice in their head. Like you guys actually hear like words sounding in your head. That's so strange." And so there was the whole NPC thing. It's like, oh, there are people that lack this kind of inner experience. And there were some variations on it too. Like it wasn't just inner voice. I think there might have been a couple variations on it. I can't remember for sure, but
Well, there was
this is
definitely
kind
this is like what ties into this guy's research was the meme was not just that people couldn't or didn't experience an inner monologue. It was also that some people couldn't or didn't seem to have the ability to make inner visualizations. So if someone
of.
says, "Don't think of a purple elephant," some people actually don't think of a purple elephant.
Hmm.
Um, and
Yeah.
then there's, other things on top of that. But yeah, that's kind of like the gist of that.
So it popped up in these articles. Yeah, it's like a series of 7 really short articles that he wrote for Psychology Today. I think like in 2011 or something.
Hmm.
So like you can read them all really quickly. But one of the things that stood out to me was the basically he did this. I think the main thing that he was no, okay, there were two kind of experiments he talked about, but one was that basically took 30 people, a sample of 30 like college kids, and used the beeper on all of them to get like a wide range of experiences. So basically they're just going throughout their day, and then the beeper will go off, and then they have to like write down what their inner experience was at that time. And I guess they've got a little bit of training for, what to
Yeah.
notice and what
Yeah.
to write down. And so he found that there were basically like 5 types of experiences, inner experiences that people will have, but that in this group of people, you get a wide range for all of them. Like, so when it came to inner speech, he found that, like 25% of all the sampled experiences were of inner speech. So like 1 out of 4 experiences involved inner speech. But that doesn't mean that, that isn't just represented. That doesn't mean 25% of the people just had inner speech and the rest didn't. That was just of the individual samples. So throughout the day, a person can have inner speech, and then later on they'll have another one, and then inner speech again. So it was just the total sample was 25%. But what he did find is that some people experience inner speech like a lot more than other people, and there's a few people who like never experience it, at least in the range of samples, like at the times that they that they were directed to describe their inner experience. And it seemed like, if I remember correctly, that seemed to be the case. I can't remember if he explicitly said if that was the case for all 5 or not. If all 5 have a range of like 0 to a lot.
It seemed to be
was it?
At least, and he doesn't say so explicitly about every single one of those things,
Yeah.
but I'm fairly sure that he does make that explicit connection for at least 1 or 2 other things, but he doesn't make it with all of them. But it does seem to be the case, at least what I've read so far of his book, that there is a range between 0 and as high as like 90% on some of these things for different people, and it's just kind of a wild distribution.
And well, I guess we can say what all 5 were. So there was inner speech, there were feelings. So it might be I'm annoyed, I'm angry, those kind of like emotional states. Inner images, like visualizations. So it might be, oh, I was thinking of that green car that I saw the other day or something. And those were the 3 main ones. But then there were 2 others that I think he said were less frequently.
No.
No, was that not?
No.
Was that not it?
It was
the other 2.
There's other 2 were 2 that were less frequently known, or what people would
just
regard as like something that takes part in your inner experience, but they are actually all 5 things are equally present.
That's right.
When you do the math and you compile all of the data together, you get like basically all 5 things are each 25% of
right.
the total experiences.
I think the 20%. No.
Well, no. He said, each are 25. I guess because there are because they overlap and stuff. Yeah. Like
so someone will
an inner
be
experience. It isn't just one.
So the other 2 were like sensory, I think, right? And then this sort of other what was it, like without any
unsymbolized thinking?
Yeah, unsymbolized thing. That I found like the most fascinating, but we can maybe go into that later.
Yeah.
Well, the sensory thing. Well, that would just be like sensation. So an actual attention given towards a sensation. So he gives several examples, like when you're going to grab the doorknob to go into another room. Most of that's not necessarily a sensory experience. It's just you're just doing it. It's a tool that you're using. But if you're noticing like the bronze shininess of the doorknob, then that's a sensory experience. It's when you actually have a more or less, like you're giving more attention and a more conscious like
when something about the tool like grabs your attention.
Right.
When you
the color,
drink a
the
Coke
smell.
And all of a sudden the fizzy just like, it assaults your nostrils, or, like you said, the glint of the door handle gets, for that split second, you're like, wow, that's really like shiny, or that's really bright, or whatever it is that suddenly grabs your attention. That would be something that is, a sensory awareness. And like you said, there's inner speech, inner vision, sensory awareness, emotions, and unsymbolized thinking. And he gives, the examples for all different kinds of things. And so, you just gave the example of what sensory awareness would be. Inner vision, we talked about that. Inner monologue, it's basically you talking in your own head. Emotions, that's kind of self-explanatory. And then the last one, unsymbolized thinking, is thinking or having a discrete thought that does not or is not accompanied by or does not consist of images or symbols. So you basically can't be thinking in your head. You can't be imagining something, and yet there must be a distinct thought there. Mm-hmm. And I can understand, and I'm with you, Luke. At first, it seems kind of strange, but in one of our previous shows where I was discussing my experience of sometimes having this sensation in the back of my mind and trying to like fiddle with things in the back of my mind, where that's part of how thinking is for me. There's not a symbol there. There's not words and there's not images. And yet, that's what I experience as thinking that would fall under the category as unsymbolized thought.
Yeah, and I kind of thought of, in one of my articles on Substack, I talked about thought chunks, right? And I think that's kind of like what I was getting from this description, because that matches also my experience that I have, that sometimes you have like this kind of thought chunk, that can be quite complex actually, and you just get it directly, it's just there instantly, and it might be something like, even some difficult question or, something about, everyday stuff, whatever, but it can be something that you just, and he calls it also in the article, he says like, use the word to apprehend, right? I think that's a good word. You apprehend it directly, and you could actually, after the fact, verbalize it or like visualize it or whatever, if you wanted to, right? But you don't have to necessarily. It's a really interesting. It's like a package, like a packet of like thought, and to my mind, it kind of like speaks to how our language and thinking might actually work, behind the scenes, with these kinds of chunks. That seem to be kind of out there, and I mean, sometimes you have to verbalize stuff as well, or imagine or visualize or whatever, bring it down to earth, so to say. And it's not that you can just replace everything with that kind of like more like out there apprehension, but it's definitely a thing, and I find it really, really interesting because it would solve some riddles, also about like how language works and stuff. So I think he's onto something there.
Well, a couple points I want to make. First, just one of the things I found funny in the article was that he quotes two, I think, psychologists like writing about inner experience, right? And so the one guy says that 100% of the time there's an inner dialogue going in all humans, and it's constantly in the background. And then the other guy says that it's impossible to see a dog and not for the word dog to go through a person's head. Like they see the letters, they see the word dog. And then and he just points out like, well, no, I'm pretty sure both those are completely wrong. And I know they're completely wrong, but he says maybe that guy sees a dog, sees the words whenever he sees an object, and maybe that guy's talking to himself all the time, but it's not, it's not.
And it's even something that, and I can't remember if he said it in the article or not, but I know that would be something that he would say, that Russell would say that, okay, we can say that maybe this guy like talks to himself all the time, and maybe this guy, does see the letters DOG when he word dog or when he sees a dog or whatever. But he wouldn't even agree with that statement. He thinks they're just they're wrong.
Yeah, he says that in the article
but
too.
The particular example was really funny. he quoted this guy who was saying like, yeah, and obviously like everybody sees like little words flashing in their minds whenever they hear a word, like the word dog, written in letters. I mean, that's just how it works. And I was like, what the hell? I've never experienced that in my life.
Well, it looks like one of the aims of the work as a whole is to get all of one's presuppositions or assumptions out of the way about what one's inner experience is. And he makes the point, not in the article, but in one of the chapters of the book, that we mediate our inner experience in very flawed ways. We don't really, in using, pristine experience as the definition of what we're trying to get at, he's, I think, pointing attention to the idea that we can get much further with ourselves if we are conscious of what that experience at the beep is, and find a way, using his framework of 5 descriptors maybe that we talked about, of describing these things. So it seems like he knows what we're up against in presenting this idea that a lot of the way we describe our experience to ourselves is, incorrect or not optimal, at the very least.
We have these presuppositions about what experience is because of things that we have within our own experience, but then also that which comes to us from culture. No one ever explicitly it told me that everyone thinks in their head all the time, although probably I've heard that at some point. But then as soon as someone says, hey, sometimes people think without words, you can't conceptualize it. You're like, what do you mean? Obviously, this is self-evidently true. And yet people generally don't investigate their actual experience, their individual moments of experience enough or at all, so as to say what their actual general inner life is actually like. And that was another thing that he points out, is that people have many generalizations, many beliefs about themselves, and yet they've never thought to investigate, well, is that actually true? Do I do these things? And I'll give an example from the book. There is a guy with the Tourette syndrome. I think he called him Mike in the book. He has Tourette syndrome, and he was a psychologist, or working towards that end. And he wrote some papers on Tourette syndrome and what he thought was going on. And this guy declared that at all times I am always like omnipresent of every experience in my body. And Russell actually wrote to him and said, hey, I'm curious about finding out whether or not this is true. And if it's true, well, let's, work on this together. So Mike works together with Russell and goes through the process of figuring out how to do this direct experience sampling, how to use the beeper, what is actually looking for. And he goes through all these different sampling days and beeps and, writing out what he was experiencing. And Mike was, to his credit, at the very beginning of the interactions with him and Russell, with the fact that he was invested in his own theory that he had written about, that he, put forward that Tourette syndrome is accompanied by an omnipresence of self-awareness, of physical self-awareness. So, that was to his credit. And because he actually seemed to want to take this honestly and sincerely, he did go through all those sessions, and in so doing found out that it was only a very small fraction of the time that he was ever aware of any particular thing in his body. Most of the time, it was external things. He was noticing something, the way his daughter's face looked, or the way that something else looked over here. It was visual. It wasn't bodily oriented. And at the same time, he was hearing, or he also said that he thought all the time. But there was only 2 instances out of the 30 plus samples that they got where there was any thinking actually going on. And so here's a guy who, he was a psychologist. He's supposed to know this stuff. And at the same time, his actual lived experience was totally different than what he thought and what he believed. And yeah.
Well, that a couple things on that. Just one of the points that he makes when discussing sensory experience in the short articles is that, well, this is kind of repetitive. I just find it interesting. Is that there are people, he said, who do what the guy thought he was doing, who are almost constantly aware of their physical sensations. So that just shows that it's not that it never happens. It's just that like the self-awareness, it can be totally off. And this relates back to the I think it was the Jessica's paradox, because I'm pretty sure Jessica was bulimic, right? That's the same example.
Yep.
So there's a few ideas all tied together, and that is, one is that we tend to generalize and assume that our own experiences are normal, and then just to kind of project that on everyone else and assume everyone else is the same. But we don't necessarily have an objective view on what our own self-awareness is actually like, which is kind of weird how those two go together. But there's a few different directions that I want to go in, but maybe I'll wait. Does anyone else have anything else on that?
Well, how about the idea? Go ahead, Luke.
Oh, go ahead, Ilan. Go ahead.
Well, just real quick, how about, I mean, this idea that we have no, we can barely describe our experience of things to ourselves, or we can in a very limited way. And B, if we assume or project that everyone else has the same set of experiences or very similar to our own, we only have our own as a reference. And since we don't often communicate our inner experiences with others, we can't very well make that assumption safely or correctly. So the other part of this is, how many of us are comfortable with recognizing, or familiar enough at least to say, okay, I was dissociated just now, or okay, right now I'm my eyelids are heavy and obviously I'm tired and it's affecting my thinking. So there are whole sets of inner experience snapshots that we're just not used to even accurately describing to ourselves. Never mind having a full kind of feedback from others in what they're going through and they're experiencing, to even be able to make statements that suggest that we share a lot of the same experiences.
Yeah, and I think these are like the two aspects that stood out for me as well from these articles. That first is like this whole diversity thing, right? That it's like seems to be that humans have like very different internal makeups, and I mean that are really like different styles. And as you said, Ilan, since we normally don't talk about these things, we hardly know about that. I mean, sometimes they kind of come through, right? I was just thinking about one time a friend of mine, he described like some route, I should take by car to me, and he was like going on and on about like, and then you see like this little green tree, on the corner, and right there you turn right, and then there's this giant red sign over there. Yeah, you keep straight, and I was like, I just can't, I don't work like that. Give me like, take the route A73, then cross to 65, and then I know, like what I have to do. But it's like, I mean, one of these instances where it kind of comes through that people have different, some people are just very visual persons, and they work with images a lot, and they can just hold like all kinds of images in their heads and memorize them and visualize and all of that. And some people are just more like verbal, and they need like numbers or like words. And some people are, and it's like it's very interesting, but we hardly ever talk about that. So
that was an interesting thing that this is one of the one of the things that I found very interesting about his articles, and which is why I ended up started reading his book, was because it dawns on you as like a duh moment when you realize like all of the psychology books that we've read about before about the differences between the variability of people and their temperaments, and you cannot project what is inside you onto other people, particularly when those people seem to be nefarious or malevolent. We take that as something given, but we don't then extend that backwards to say that the way that they experience the world is entirely different at an experiential level, which was kind of interesting. Well, I mean, it was more than kind of interesting. It was interesting enough for me to get his book. And then the other thing was that, kind of like going back to the beginning of the discussion, Harrison, when you mentioned the NPC meme regarding the people without the inner monologue or without the inner visualizations, the reason why I even got interested in this and started looking, it was because I didn't think that was true. I didn't think that alone was enough to suggest that the person didn't have something inside them, something deeper. And, now lo and behold, we're like more aware of our own inner experiences by reading about this stuff. And you start to notice, hey, I actually don't visualize very much. And I actually don't talk to myself very often, or as often as I thought I did. And it seems that just like in the big 5 personality traits, how humanity has this like, bell curve distribution of traits, it seems to be that the very same thing applies into these 5 sensory types, where there's a bell curve distribution where most people experience pretty much everything to varying degrees. And some people experience like none, and some people experience almost all of their experiences are in one particular form or another. And that's just like a natural distribution, which kind of blows my mind because I'd never even entertained that notion, let alone thought it was possible.
Yeah. Well, the second, I mentioned there were like 2 observations that he made in his articles. The first one being the psychologist saying, everyone sees words or something like that. But the second one was that about non-symbolic or is it non or unsymbolic thought?
Unsymbolized thinking.
Unsymbolized thinking. Yeah. So in unsymbolized thinking, he just made a brief comment in the article that I think he said most psychologists would even deny that such a thing is possible.
Yep.
It's just you don't hear about it. It's not considered a possibility, which is interesting given that, like you said, Adam, that it's just as frequent as the other 4 modes. And so when you look at the lack of an internal monologue in some, like that on its own, that might sound really weird, but that person can just be having unsymbolized thinking that's making up for that deficit. And because like he gives a really simple example of unsymbolized thinking, like Luke, you'd mentioned like an entire thought packet. Well, the example he gives is a really small thought packet. It's like, I won't use his example. I'll use one that I just thought of. It's like when you're walking down a hallway or down a road and you notice something new that's there, and like you might have a thought packet that says, I wonder where that came from, but no words are going through your head.
Yeah.
So it's like, what you're thinking, the idea of your thought, and then you can translate it and say, okay, well, how would you put what you were thinking into words? And then you say, where did that thing come from? And it's totally obvious. And I think probably most people have had that experience if they reflect on it, because I have those all the time where I'm thinking about something, but I'm just thinking, like we were talking about this another time, Adam, like kind of like an analogy for it is thinking the shape of it. Like I've got this blob, there's the thought, and it might be a question like, oh, I wonder what that means in relation to that thing over there. How do these two ideas fit together? But I'm not actually thinking those in words. I can think them in words, and then oftentimes I do, usually before I'm falling asleep. But but there's the possibility for that unsymbolized thought, and probably to a greater degree than most people even realize that they're doing it, because they don't have the word for it, and they don't actually realize they're doing it. But it happens all the time. I think probably a much greater degree of thinking is unsymbolized than we think, because you could probably make an argument that like the vast majority of just like directing your attention at things is provoking like unsymbolized thoughts that are just they're unstated. It's just, oh, there's that thing over there.
Yeah, they're
right?
almost like part of the environment, right? They're floating in the background, so to say. It's almost as if you and then you can pick one and you can look at it a bit, more in depth, and then at some point you kind of have to do something with it, right? Either verbalize it or like visualize it or paint it or whatever, and right. If not, like it just keeps floating, away, sort of thing.
Well, before you get your thought, Ilana, I just want to respond to Luke, because like Luke, well, I'm sure we've all experienced this, but like Luke as a Substack writer, you've probably had this experience too, or let me know if you don't. But I'll, like, when I'm writing an article, I will often have the idea of the article, right?
The entire thing, in a sense, right?
Yeah. The entire thing, and then it's just a matter of trying to decode it into words and to put it into a structure. And it's the same thing with music. And you hear that about like from composers all the time, where it's like, okay, I have the entire piece. Now it's just a matter of like writing it out and making it make sense and putting it in a sequential order to capture the, that nebulous thing and nebulous isn't even the right word for it, because it's there, like, what it is. And,
but it's kind of elusive.
It's just like a more complex form of that short sentence, right?
Well, I was wondering if unsymbolized thinking is also demonstrated in some way in a high-level conversation. So, for instance, there are some times when we're discussing something and I am consciously thinking of the responses I know I want to give to what someone else has said. And then there are other times, and I've noticed this among others as well as myself, is that there is almost no conscious thought involved in what it is I want to say. It's just there, and it's appropriate, and it reflects some amount of complexity or knowledge. And I'm thinking, well, I wasn't even thinking about that. That wasn't even, something that I was ruminating over or reflecting upon in that exchange with someone. It just came out. So would you say, be a facet of or a demonstration of unsymbolized thinking, for flesh that idea out a little bit?
Maybe not as Hurlburt's talking about it, but I can definitely see where you're coming from, and I'd say yes. Like, it'd be interesting to hear what a Hurlburt would say about that. I get the impression that at least in the few words of his that I've read, that it's more simplistic and categorized, and that might be something that doesn't fall into the category that he would necessarily like write about. But I think that at the very least, it's a valid like extension of the idea. I don't know, Adam. Do you know if?
We'll go try and explain it again, Alon, because I'm not entirely sure that I grasped what you were trying to say. Because Hurlburt would, like Harrison was saying, it would be more concrete, such as to say that, I hear a piece of music and I'm like, wow, this is awesome. But the words, wow, this is awesome, don't go through my head.
Mm-hmm. I guess it would be more towards a thinking area, as opposed to a response to an internal response to stimuli, like hearing a piece of music. That there is this thinking that is going on behind the scenes without my. Hurlburt likes to say, what was that quote that he makes reference to with William James before the
footlights of consciousness? Before
the footlights of consciousness come to it. So there are things that are ideas, packets, as you were alluding to before, Luke, that are or packages that are already there, or are being processed on a level where the footlights aren't shining a light on it, and they just come up of their own accord.
I think I kind of get where you're coming from, and this actually ties into yet another reason why I got interested in this particular topic and delved into it, was because after our conversation, on the Mind Matters show, years ago or whenever it was, when we were talking about this thinking going on behind the head that had a certain shape to it, but there wasn't like anything visual to it or anything like that. And then I was giving it some more thought and I was thinking about it, and it seemed to be kind of that which occurred underneath or before verbalized words. And so I realized that I thought without words before I encountered this work. And so when I found that there was an actual word for it, that just kind of like was like, oh, this is a thing. Now, to get to what Hurlburt might say, Hurlburt would say that you can't say anything in a general sense outside of moments themselves. If you wanted to say something general, it would have to be a composition of discrete moments of experience. And then when you have enough discrete moments of experience of a particular type, then you can make a generalization and say that, these are times when you are thinking unsymbolically. But what might be more of what you were talking about is something that would be unconscious. Something that's just back in your mind percolating, but you're not actively engaged with it, or it isn't popping up into your mind as a complete and discrete thought.
Yeah, but I think
or like a pre-thought. It's the unconscious process that is going on before you're, like, while you're engaged in conversation. It's whatever's going on unconsciously, the instant before you start talking. So you're not necessarily fully aware of what you're going to be saying, but like unconsciously there's a direction that's being put into your words, like that you're going to be chasing as you finish your sentence.
Yeah, and I think like there's something related to that might be a bit closer to what Hurlburt is talking about, although it goes a bit outside of this concept as well. But in the other direction, so to speak. So when we talk to someone, and we try to understand what he's saying, then there's this kind of like reverse experience where you hear like the words and you actually grasp like the whole thought chunk, and it's like this shape, Adam, that you talked about, the shape of the back in the back of your head. It's kind of like taking shape, so to say, while you listen to someone expressing a thought, and if you understand it, right? So if you really understand it, then you kind of get the whole shape. And oftentimes it's not that you don't have to like decode like each word or like, think how they relate, as like some linguists, like still, think about it, that it's kind of like each word has kind of like this referent and there's this logic, and then you combine it all in your head and reconstruct it. It's more like you get this whole string of words, and oftentimes you don't even listen to the words like specifically. It's just a stream, and you kind of like boom, you grab the thought, and it makes total sense. That's scientists tend to like reduce or like have this like reductionist approach where they look at like words and say, okay, let's take the simplest part of it, like one word, and see like how this one word works, and then we infer like how other words work and stuff. But it's more like this more wholesome thing that's going on, and I think that's kind of like related in a sense, right? Where what Harrison talked about with when you have this kind of like thought chunk that's bubbling around, and then you grab it, and you write an article or whatever, and it's kind of like the reverse process. And I think this, what he talks about with this unsymbolized thinking, it's to my mind, it really points to some very, very interesting questions, like how the explicit, the verbalized, the visualized relates to the more unexplicit, that is still like sort of like the precursor to that, right? Mm-hmm. Or like on another level. So it's like we kind of have to get it down to earth, with our methods, but it's somehow there in a sense. And I think you guys also talked about in one of the shows, what was his name? Like I forgot. Like with the sort of like paranormal field, that it's symbolic field that is all around us and that can like produce these like effects. It's been a while.
Was it the Bigfoot?
No, I think it was
the James Carpenter.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. That was what I was thinking about. And so it seems to be kind of like related to that idea, that there's just like a world out there that has information in it, right? And we kind of interact with it in a sense. And even when we communicate with each other, it's not like this mechanistic coding and decoding. It's more like we interact via this sort of information world, where these thought chunks live and these shapes are, I know this is getting a bit out there, but
yeah, no,
it's not in the book.
There's two things that I want to say to that. Well, there's one thing I want to say to that, but the first, I want to go back to what Alon was talking about, and I'm just going to pull a quote from Hurlburt's last article, Thinking Without Words. He writes, "An unsymbolized thought is not hinty or general, or merely a part of some other phenomenon. An unsymbolized thought is just as complete and directly apprehendable as an inner speaking or an inner seeing." So basically, it has to be, a distinct and, expressible thought, just, unexpressed more or less.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
And I was just going to say to Luke that, and this is just like a really quick thing. No, I agree. This is fascinating, and it's totally blowing my mind. And like, I want to like dive into the deep end on all of this because it's, it's fascinating. And you're like, what does all of this mean in terms of people, in terms of consciousness, in terms of, what this avenue of research can bring forward for people in terms of different diagnoses. And we haven't really touched on it very much, but the implications for Tourette syndrome and for bulimia, if we want to get into those in more in depth, are, not insignificant.
Yeah. Let's get into that in a minute. I just wanted to bring up one connection while we're on the topic, and like when I saw Hurlburt using the words like pristine inner experience, I don't think this isn't an exact correlation here between these two ideas, but it reminded me of Whitehead, because Whitehead has a few different levels of what you might call perception or experience, what he calls like apprehension. And so I'm gonna get them wrong because I can't remember the exact scheme, off the top of my head, but basically he has, like, if you start from the bottom, he's got basically like a direct experience. And he equates that to another word he uses for it is feeling, or like apprehension in the mode of causal efficacy or something like that. And that would be what an atom feels when it, interacts with another atom, electrically or, physically. And then, but it's also the sensation that you have of like you're in your gut. It's a very basic, simple, like almost sensation level, like the basic of the basis of what we experience as humans. And then you've got what is it, like perception in the mode of causal no, that was the first one, but then you've got like perception in the mode of presentational immediacy, and that would be like the so that's kind of what I was thinking that Hurlburt might be talking about, and I think they're not quite exactly the same, but they're similar, because it's like it's your direct sensory experience in Whitehead's case, like particularly vision and hearing, before we add like thinking on top of that, and before we reflect on it, and so it's like the purest form of sensory experience that is kind of before it gets
mediated
and well,
changed.
It's already mediated by virtue of the fact that it goes through sensory organs, and it's affected by memory and all that stuff. But then it gets even more complexified by and interpreted by the conscious mind. I think that's kind of how I remember it. But I think that something might be going on there with unsymbolized thought too, in the sense that it's almost like it almost seems like a more direct and less mediated form of thinking, for instance. So it's like you're skipping putting it into words. Like putting it into words is almost like an afterthought, which helps. Like, and if you think about it, like it makes sense why we have language, right? Because we can't directly share our thoughts, by pushing other people. Like it's not like we can communicate complex thoughts through very simple and basic physical sensations. Like you can make it more complex, like with Braille, for instance. Like that's a possibility, but that is a form of symbolization. That is a form of putting it into a thought into symbolized form. But so when you just have the thought, like, oh, where did that thing come from? The only way to communicate that, aside from a facial expression, which might be misinterpreted, or like direct telepathy, is through words, is through a symbolic form of communication, where it's almost like you have, like there's a basic form of perception or knowing, which is what Whitehead calls apprehension. It's like it's direct, and you can have that direct knowing of an atom bonding with another atom. Ooh, I'm bonding with another atom. I know it's happening because I'm
no pun intended.
Yeah, because I feel it. I'm experiencing it, right? That's the direct basic experience. But then through communication, it's almost like communication is a way of, or symbolic communication is a way of translating that, like a direct experience from one person to another, or trying to. It's an imperfect method, but it's a way of saying, here's the direct experience I had. Now let's see if you can get an idea, if I can convey that direct experience to you, so you can at least get an idea of that experience that I just had. And so that's what we're doing when we're sharing our thoughts with other people, is we're trying to get into their heads in a way that we ordinarily can't, which would be like a form of like super telepathy or something like that. Like language is one of the ways in which we do that, and of course, it's helped by all kinds of other things like nonverbal cues and communications. But so at least the idea I'm throwing out there is that there's an unsymbolized thought, and that like verbal thought and verbal communication is a way of like translating what in essence are unsymbolized thoughts at their root. Because and maybe symbolized thought is just like an extra layer on top of something that is fundamentally unsymbolized at a basic level, which I think would be really interesting. Which could mean that at least some of the people who don't think in verbal thoughts might actually be thinking on a more basic level, with less layers of mediation between the thought the thought itself and the symbolic form of it. But then again, that could be totally wrong.
Or both, or there are some, who are at this very high level of functioning, or at least functioning that looks a certain way, and then at the other end of the spectrum, it kind of looks the same for some people who are at a totally low level of functioning, and whatever that entails. But I did want to quickly I wanted to get back to, you evoked the idea of information, Luke, and how, somebody can say something and it may not even be all that much, and there's so much implied in it. There's so much behind it that what might seem like a throwaway sentence or two to one person might carry a whole wealth of information and meaning to another person. And it's very interesting to me how that works, and probably just suggests again, that we all have very different makeups and perceive information and statements in very different ways. And I did just want to address one thing that you mentioned now, Harrison, about this kind of direct perception of something. We've made fun of George W. Bush about his comment, I think with my gut, but there is a very real experience, I think, of a perception of something that doesn't quite sit right, that is unmediated by thinking, or at least symbolized thinking. Maybe it's unsymbolized, and bam, it's right there in the stomach. That something doesn't sit well. It's not easily digested. And having had that experience a couple of times before, and realizing only later on, after I've done all this kind of mental gymnastics as to what that feeling in the pit of my stomach meant, I had to go back and say, you know what? That was a direct, it was more physiological than it was cognitive, but that was a kind of direct experience of something that some part of my being was perceiving correctly, but couldn't verbalize or explain to myself and assess correctly at that moment.
It comes, I think, like that brings up a number of different possibilities. And one thing that is, he doesn't say anything explicitly about it, but it's kind of there in the questions that he asks people. What was going on at the moment of the beep went off? Okay, so it was a word. There was a word. Where was it? Was it? There was an example of a guy who was thinking about a theorem, G equals V squared over R. And he described it as being, the symbols were written in pencil in his mind about like 1/3 of the way back there in the center of his mind. But that doesn't need to necessarily be the case that words or thinking need be in the space that we call the mind or in the brain area. Maybe it is in the gut. Maybe some people actually do think with their gut. And that's where the thinking takes place. I don't know, but it at least comes up as a possibility now that we are having to question and bracket all of our presuppositions about where thinking can or cannot take place.
Well, just let me throw this in here just as a possible motivator for future ideas. As we've had Joseph Azizi on the show a few times talking about Gurdjieff, and Gurdjieff. It's not clear in a lot of his writings, but like Joseph points out in his book and in conversations with us, he taught a lot of what he called like inner exercises, and these were kind of like meditative exercises. And the impression I get from reading about them, and is it? I'll give a couple examples. I'm not sure if these are actual examples or just kind of showing the kind of principles, but it might be to say a certain word inside, but to have that word resonate or to place that word in various parts of your body. So I've tried doing something like that every once in a while, because usually like that formula, I visualize it at a certain space in my head region, right? But I can project my voice, my inner voice, to other parts of my body, and it's kind of weird. Like if you imagine your inner voice being inside like your big toe or something, like it's possible. It's kind of weird, but but you can move things around like that, or you can, if you visualize that, like, or E equals MC squared, for instance, you can visualize that in your head, and then you can move it around. Like, okay, now I'm visualizing it, over here, or over here. Now I'm visualizing it in my stomach, right? Yeah. And then there are like, so there's some that's a separate research topic for like Gurdjieff studies is what was Gurdjieff actually doing, and is that helpful? What's the result of these kinds of experiments on oneself to project one's consciousness, or to like move sensations around one's body, to bring in sensations from different parts of one's body and put them together in different combinations, and then to have like a full body sensation. Like, is any of that helpful? Like, what's actually going on there? But then also, what was the other one I was thinking of? Like, moving it around, thinking. Oh, I can't remember what the other implication I was thinking of was, but just in general, it's just kind of weird and kind of interesting.
Yeah, but
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I think this might be useful, like in two ways. These sorts of exercise. I mean, first of all, you kind of get better with with the different modes of inner experience, in a sense, right? So you just get better with visualizing, verbalizing, if you can kind of pull off these sorts of things, right? And you get better with sensations, or like the sensation mode, because you get in touch with where in the body you have the feelings, or the sensations rather, and all of that. So you get like more aware and more practice, with these sorts of things, and more conscious about them, as opposed to them just randomly happening, basically. So that's one big advantage, and I would also say it's probably helps like balancing these things out, and again being more conscious about it, and not like be stuck in one mode, all the time, that sort of thing. And also, and I think that comes through in the articles as well, that Hurlburt wrote, that like there's this thing about like our attention, like where do we direct our attention in these sorts of situations. And it seems to be that a lot of it, unfortunately, is like totally unconscious, right? So it just happens, and as he says, like we don't even know, what exactly is going on, unless we stop to really like think about it and feel it and investigate it. So that's kind of like a bad state of affairs, right? I mean, our inner experience arguably is like what makes us tick, in a sense, right? So if we have no clue what's going on there, and even what we're doing, what mode we are in, whatever, then yeah, I mean, it's like not really good, in a sense. And one example kind of stood out for me in these articles is about that girl who got like approached like by her boss, kind of like made advances, and she was sitting there, and he was kind of like getting closer, like in a creepy sort of way, and when she reflected upon what she actually felt in that, or I think it might have been like a beep situation, I don't remember, but it
was a beep moment. The beep went off as the boss was coming and approaching her.
Yeah, right.
And making her uncomfortable, and her like leaning back trying to get space, and that was when the beep went off.
Yeah, and then she kind of like really felt the sensation of her spine, like leaning back, and that's actually what she really did in that situation. She wasn't thinking, oh my God, my boss is trying to get me or whatever, or like I'm afraid, or verbalizing, oh, I'm afraid, or having like creepy images or whatever. She was just focused entirely on the sensations in her spine, and that kind of shows how not good it is when we are not aware of this kind of stuff at all, right? Because it's just we could be in a dangerous situation, and all we focus on is like, oh, how does my spine feel, or it just feels random, right? And also it's like when you're in a situation like that, you just want to be more conscious about it, and I kind of lost my train of thought there, but in essence, I found that really interesting how seemingly random it can be. And the other thing I want to say is also like when we interact with people, it kind of, I mean, that example really brings home how we make all kinds of assumptions, right? When we observing people or interacting with other people, and we think that, oh, they must think this and that, like, and maybe they must feel this or that, but maybe there's just something completely else going on. Maybe the person is just like focused on her spine in that moment, and you couldn't know, and there's not even any thinking going on. So I found that really, really interesting. So I think these kinds of exercises that Harrison talked about, I think that was the point, about that. That's kind of like the point of these exercises, I suppose, to just be more conscious about all these things and become just better at managing. And it's almost like a virtuosity about it, right? Like a master level of of awareness at some point where you can just juggle all of that stuff.
There's I found the quote that made me think of, kind of all of this discussion of people not being aware of what's going on within themselves. There was a particular quote from his book that I thought really interesting. And so this is talking about, people who aren't very good at being aware of moments, what moments are. Like, they'll be told what a beep is, what they're supposed to be doing, paying attention to what's going on inside themselves when a beep happens. When a beep occurs, you reflect and, say what it is that was going on within inside you at the time. And it's very difficult for people. And it takes several days sometimes for people to actually be able to be comfortable enough to be in the moment. And he says, furthermore, we think that it is not only the moment of the beep that repels people, but moments, period. Thus, the sentence could equally well be written as, people seem actively repelled by moments. In this book, I do not presume to know why that is so, but I'm pretty sure that it is so. Being unambiguously specific does not come naturally to many, if not most people. Most people do not know they are repelled by being unambiguously specific, apparently because one doesn't know much about one actively. One does not know about what one actively avoids. Sorry. And so just to sum it up as like, one of the reasons why people aren't good at knowing what they actually experience is because people actively avoid it because it's uncomfortable.
So speaking of uncomfortable, many years ago in an experiential workshop I participated in, one of the assignments was it was a lot of time. It was like 40 minutes or maybe a half hour each day, writing down or describing to yourself what your experience is. So like what you would write is, right now I'm experiencing the thought that I'm bored. Right now, because I'm sitting in the car and it's cold, I feel the sensation of cold feet. And the idea was to just sit in your experience, but also to see all these sensations and thoughts and feelings and reactions as experiences, so that it would help one to establish a distance between what yourself is, what your being is maybe, and what it is that you're experiencing. You're not less reactive, in other words, and to be cognizant of your experiences as experiences. So, when you said a moment ago, Adam, that people are uncomfortable, with the moment, with the present, essentially. It was many years ago, so I may not be even describing it correctly, but that's what I remember. It was to just sit in the moment of being aware of and describing, because you had to write it down as you were going through this. And you would also notice the number of times you were just in the moment wanting to avoid thinking, writing down another perception or another thought.
And likely when you were there trying to write that stuff down, there's many things that you've forgotten about. You might have, for example, been sitting there with a notepad and pen or pencil, whatever it was you were writing with. You might have been standing there or sitting there in your car and noticing something in particular about the pen or the pencil. You're like, oh, that's kind of interesting, and completely forgotten about it, that was actually part of the experience of you writing down what you're supposed to be, what you were actually experiencing. And you don't remember that, and you probably didn't write it down, even if you thought it, because your presupposition about what you were supposed to be writing down didn't include some of the things that you actually were experiencing.
Mm-hmm. That's likely, actually.
So if we want to kind of like tie that together and get back to the bulimia subjects, Harrison, do you want to jump in with that, or do you want me to kind of like lay it out?
You lay it out, and then I'll fill in some details if I think that you missed something interesting.
Okay. So and I can't remember, it's probably irrelevant at what point he interviewed a particular person. In the articles, he refers to her as Jessica, and also in the book, she's referred to as Jessica. And Jessica was a bulimic woman. I believe she was 22, but that could be wrong. At any rate, in the articles, he talks about how, well, he actually directly asks us, the readers, to think about what we think of as the inner experience of a bulimic woman. And that is our task. And so you think about, what would it be like to be, a bulimic woman? And thinking about it myself, and also asking several other people of my acquaintance, the general gist of it was exactly what he wrote in his articles, which is that these women were disproportionately preoccupied or obsessed with their own weight, with culture, the culture of weight and what it's like to be thin and wanting to be thin, obsessing about how much one eats, and those kinds of things. And that generally seems to be what most people consider the inner experience of someone with bulimia. However, in one of his articles on the inner experience of bulimia, he wrote that in the 24 bulimic women that he has interviewed, including Jessica, they all exhibited what he called fragmented multiplicity. And what he means by that is, at one point, they'll be going through their day, the beep goes off. In that moment, they will be thinking about how much they love their boyfriend. Simultaneously, they'll be thinking, I wonder if there's MSG in Fritos. Simultaneously, also thinking about, whether they fed their goldfish, while simultaneously thinking blah, 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 and so on it goes. And it would be multiple disconnected things. It's not like, I'm experiencing my girlfriend yelling at me and feeling anger at her at the same time. That's more or less the same experience. It's not a fragment of something different. It's not fragmented. Like the awareness is more or less along the same lines. Whereas, thinking about how much you love your partner and whether or not there's MSG in Fritos, those are two disconnected and separate things. And he found that all of the women with bulimia experienced that to varying degrees. The study that you mentioned earlier, Harrison, where he took 30 students from a college and had them go through the sampling, the beep sampling stuff, he found that within that population of people, of 30 people, the median, so basically the majority of people experienced no multiplicity of experience whatsoever. It was more or less just, I'm noticing the glint on the door handle. I'm thinking, I'm saying to myself, E equals MC squared, etc. It's generally just the one thing. But there was a couple of people, who did have a fragmented multiplicity experience, but the highest it ever got was only 30% of their experience was ever like that. These bulimic women were 50% above that as the lowest end of the spectrum. So whereas 30% was the absolute highest in this general sample of what you might call the normal population, these bulimic women at the very bottom end were at 45. And at the highest end, we're at 92% of their waking experiences were these fragmented multiplicities, this fractured awareness in this different way. And yet, so that is what is part of their awareness. And yet no one talks about it. No one knows about it. No one asked. It was never in any of the literature. Every single one of these women, none of them knew that was part of their experience. They had no idea that they did this, much less that it wasn't normal. They had no idea. And it's incredibly fascinating. And that again comes back to what Hurlburt wrote and termed Jessica's paradox. Jessica has all of these things going on in her awareness at the same time. And Jessica's in particular was incredibly interesting because she would have a sentence, why are there such pretty blonde women shown on TV for men to look at? It's a very long sentence. But at any rate, one of the beeps that she had was while that sentence was being spoken in her mind by two separate voices simultaneously, each one taking different random parts of the sentence and saying it simultaneously. That's crazy. And yet, when asked about it, she was like, yeah, I know, it sounds crazy and totally ludicrous, and I don't see how it's possible. And yet, that was how it was.
Yeah, that was weird. Yeah, because so when you first described that to me, either you described it wrong or I interpreted what you were saying wrong.
I probably described it wrong.
Yeah, that that there were two voices and they were interchanging the words. So voice one would say the first word, voice two the second, and it would go back and forth, right? What are you doing today? But no, it was the first part of the sentence was one voice, but then all the other words were distributed like randomly and simultaneously by the two different voices, and yet somehow so she would, to understand her own thought, she had to like essentially go through an automatic like decoding of that and unscrambling of that message, and she could do that probably just because she's used to it because it happens so often. So she understood what the sentence was, but actually going back and looking at it, it was like, oh well, how does that happen? First of all, why is it doing it? Why do I have two voices completing sentences together? Mm-hmm. Why is it not sequential? And also, presumably, how do I make sense of that? Like,
yeah, how is it possible that I can hear these two simultaneous voices and know that it's the same thought at the same time, and also be aware of whatever else is going on in her awareness at that time? It blows your mind. And
yeah, so what's going on there?
And I should point out that Jessica's realization that was an experience that she had, it was not on her first day. It's one point that he makes, not necessarily in the articles, but definitely in his book, that this sampling process is an iterative process. It is something where both the interviewer and the interviewee, the subject as well as the investigator, both have to work together to get better at either the interviewer asking the right questions or the subject paying better attention and learning how to describe things, or learning what the moment after the beep really means. So it wasn't on the first day that Jessica was just like, she heard her first beep and was like, huh, that's weird. It was actually like several days into the sampling process where she had gotten coaching and things, and that was what it was. That is what allowed her to be able to recognize this for the amazing experience that it was. And to go further with this, another interesting thing that he found, and again, I don't think this was in the articles either. I think this was in the book. He found, as a consequence of these women going through the process of recognizing and dissecting, if you will, these experiences, that their urge to purge, to vomit, to induce vomiting, lowered.
I was going to ask that.
Yeah, that's super interesting, because it kind of speaks to the idea that, our thinking is just so super important. I mean, if we define thinking not just as, like the act of like thinking abstractly or whatever, but just, what's going on in our heads, because this seems to be like primary in a sense of how we do things and how we experience the world, right? And it can be super, and it goes back to like the Gurdjieff exercise and all of that, right? Because once you become aware of these kinds of things that happen, whether it's like extreme cases, where you have different voices over there, but just like inner monologues or like thoughts that are repeating, then you can kind of get out of certain patterns. And if you have an inner monologue that always tells you the same thing in a given situation, then yeah, you want to like maybe do something about that, kind of change it, in the direction you want to go. And just to give an example, because for me, I've always had like sort of anxiety issues, that just come out of nowhere, that you just get anxious about something. It doesn't even have to. Sometimes there's not even a reason or anything. It's just just comes, and I think it's quite common. And so, but when I started like noticing how that works, that really helped, because when you notice that, so okay, I feel this way, and then my thinking always goes in the same direction. It's always does this and that. My inner monologue does this and that, and then I feel this and that, and then there are these sensations. And once you kind of like become aware of that, whereas before you was just anxious and you freak out about something or whatever, then suddenly the whole picture changes, and you can just recognize these things and stop certain patterns just from playing out. And it's actually easier than one would think, but the key is just to recognize the stuff. And I can totally, and I think psychologists kind of like know that. I mean, if they're any good, and that's a good example of how that actually helps people, how even in an extreme case like that.
When I first read that description of Jessica's, multiplicity, thinking all of these things and in parts, not to mention the MSG and the Doritos at the same time, I thought, oh, okay, so she has a serious case of disordered thinking. She's there's a lack of rigor or discipline in her thought processes. For whatever reason, be it trauma or bad habits or not being consciously aware of her thought processes, that feeds into this pattern, as you said, Luke, of behavior. And yeah, I think that's what a good therapist does is, we're so used to thinking along certain lines and making assumptions about certain things, about ourselves, about others, that in a sense that the researchers that that are described, because I think it's more than one, right? Like I think that there might be even a team of people looking at the descriptions and discussing it among themselves as well. Was that was in part
are you
of the
talking
chapter
about
that I read?
The actual like interview process after people would take their samples?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it would be just him doing the interview. Sometimes it would be him and two other people. Sometimes him and just another, an undergraduate student or a graduate student or something like that. It was, it kind of varied. It wasn't necessarily, always a group, but it seemed like, maybe, well, I mean, it's hard to say, whether it was like a team at the beginning and then after he felt like he was comfortable enough to be able to do it himself, that then it just became, just him. I'm just, going off of what I've read in his book, that it seems like, he's done it where it's just him, but then he's also had it where it's multiple people. And part of that is because, kind of like you're saying, you have to be able to be aware of your own biases and presuppositions when you're interviewing, so that way you're not leading anyone, and at the same time, making it comfortable for them to be able to be vulnerable about their actual experience, because for all the things that go into whether or not you're going to be honest with somebody, as far as wanting to be liked and not wanting to seem crazy and all that kind of thing. Yeah. So that was
I got a couple of questions. I got a couple of questions inspired by something Ilan said, because he talked about like the disordered thinking and how this might. The impression I got from what you said, Ilan, was that the disordered thinking might be like causally downstream, from the actual like bulimic dysfunction, but or upstream. Yeah.
Probably upstream.
But I think that might be an assumption. So I'm wondering if there's some things that Adam might be able to share from the book, because we don't know if that's necessarily a cause or a common symptom, or how it's related to the bulimia. And then there's also the question of, they've got these multiplicities, these fragmented multiplicities, and it seems like through the process of becoming aware of them and being able to like write them down and articulate them, that seems to have had a positive effect, right, Adam? Mm-hmm. But does it have any effect on the frequency of the fragmented multiplicities? Are they still like the same percentage that they were before? Is awareness of them the only factor that changed, or did that go down as well? Do you know, or does he know?
Okay, so the two things, I'll start with the last one first, and regarding whether the frequency changes, that I haven't come across yet, but that was something that I was wondering as well, because it seemed to be that, like I said, I'll kind of give his thinking on it as he wrote it, because it's, I think, chapter 3 maybe, on bulimia in particular. He says that from what he sees, from what these women experience and describe, they basically describe a cycle where they will induce vomiting, right? They'll purge, and then they will find relief, temporary relief. And what that means experientially is that the number of things that their mind pays attention to, or things that are in their awareness, are lower, right? So if they had 10 things in their awareness before they purged, and then they purge, and then it's down to, 1, 2, or 3. And then as time progresses, and more things start to then build up in their awareness. And as that builds up into their mind, they become nauseous. And that's why they vomit, is because the overwhelming...
It's like a symbolic function.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Yeah. And so it built up, and they get nauseous, and then they vomit. So his thinking is that maybe it has something to do with the inner ear. There's so much going on in their minds and their awareness that it's making them physically actually nauseous. And that's why they purge. And then the whole story of them being preoccupied with weight and with size is an ad hoc or a post hoc narrative that comes out as a means of trying to explain why they do this. So that's kind of how he sees it. And he realizes that that coming up with an accurate theory of, what is bulimia and how does it really work, that is beyond the scope of the book and is not the point of the book. He's just merely proposing something that bears out in his sampling. Mm-hmm. And so in order to really get to the bottom of any of that requires way more study.
Yeah, I'd have an hypothesis for future studies would be to look not just at bulimics, but a bunch of other disorders, as many disorders as possible, and to see how many of them are similar, because just the thought packet that went into my mind when you were saying that was that bulimia, it's possible that bulimia as a disorder might be possible that it's more of a possible symptom of a different underlying disorder, right? So you have something underlying that can express itself as bulimia or
something
XYZ
else.
And that the vomiting, the purging is just one means by which something is done to bring equilibrium back to the body and the mind.
So that's another thing, right? You have this fractured multiplicity of experiences within the bulimic women. Well, that got me thinking, what if similar to how the big 5 personality traits has a bell curve distribution, and different disorders, psychological disorders, bear out in the distribution of these 5 different personality traits? Perhaps then there's a similar correlation between different disorders of various types we don't know yet, and people's varying distribution of experience.
Of inner experiences, yeah.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. I mean, I had the similar thought as Harrison, maybe, this kind of fragmented consciousness is in a sense at the root of this problem, but it can also show up in or materialize in different ways, right? So maybe one woman might purge, another woman might shoot heroin or whatever, I mean, it's who knows,
or cut herself.
So it's kind of interesting. And also I wonder if, we kind of know, I suppose, from this research that these women are not necessarily aware of what is going on there, right? So it might be really more like a vague sort of sensation of pressure building up, and sort of like in any addiction or similar what's the word, like pathological behavior in a sense, right? So it follows certain pathways and you kind of do it, but you're not really aware of what exactly is pushing you, or how what kind of voices might be going on, and so it's really fascinating.
I think it would be something similar to where, kind of like what you're saying, Luke, people might have similarities. And you can correct me if I'm wrong, Harrison, but it seems to me that there's similarities in terms of the personality trait distribution for different disorders. Some things might have, close similarities, but they might present themselves differently according to what would be the word, history, personal history, or physiology. Would that be fair to say?
I think I'm not quite sure if I get what you're saying, but the way I think about it, the only way I've talked about the big 5 in terms of disorders is personality disorders, and that there's one theory that there might be an underlying personality disorder, factor that then expresses itself in different ways depending on your personality traits.
Yeah.
So if if you're neurotic, you might be more of like an anxious narcissist type. But if you're really low on neuroticism, then you're more of like the cold-blooded psychopath, or the even keel schizoid. So the dials of the big five are kind of like how the personality disorder will manifest. That's at least one theory. So that's the way that I kind of think about that. But maybe you can you're like kind of expanding on that.
Yeah, kind of. That was basically the gist of kind of where I was starting off with. But at the same time, perhaps maybe there are disorders or individuals who have similar, we'll call them big five overlaps, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're pretty close. And then just because of their personal situation and personal history, then it might take form X as opposed to form Y. It's still going to have like the same Z destructive habit, or maybe it's a different destructive habit, but it's still a destructive habit. I guess it's my point. It's a destructive habit, but what it looks like is kind of dependent on the actual person. But maybe if you were to look at their inner experience, there might be, a close approximation. Something is overwhelming.
That makes sense.
That's kind of where I was coming from.
Yeah, and it might relate to the five types of inner experience, right? So someone who's more of a sensory person, like maybe someone who experiences primarily sensory experiences might cut because it's a much more sensory experience to release the physical discomfort. This is I'm just throwing this out there. I have no idea.
No, it's total speculation.
Just for viewers,
because
I don't know the inner experience of cutting.
Exact science is for like is yesterday's news. Like that's just let's just speak the truth, man.
It's my inner truth.
And then like people who are primarily feeling might have like extreme anxiety or depression or something like that. Maybe there are different expressions based on where the the center of gravity of your what's the word? Immediate experience, or your, how does he call it? Pristine experiences.
Yeah. Perhaps the habits of your pristine experience. And this is, that kind of gets into some of the farther down the line topics that he talks about in the book, because he has, sections on the book devoted to like the one I'm reading now, which is on Tourette syndrome. There's another one on schizophrenia. There's another one on virtuosity and virtuosos. So he has several other, disorders, if you want to call virtuosity a disorder. There's other psychological things or groupings or pairings or whatever you want to call it, that he goes into in the book. And then he also seems to think that a lot of these are learned, which is like a whole other thing.
A lot of what are learned?
The five experiences: inner seeing, inner speech, unsymbolized thinking, feeling, all of them. At least, that's what it seems to be like, what he's saying. Because I kind of jumped around a little bit to find things that I thought were particularly interesting, and that I kind of like jumped the shark on that one and went straight into that. And I'm like, what? So now I'm having to, go back and go forward. So I think we can.
I'd be interested to hear what he has to say about that, because like, how do you learn an unsymbolized thought that you have no idea that you're doing and that you don't know that other people do?
Don't wait. In the words of a famous Scotsman, don't know.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Cool.
Yeah. I think that will do it for now, unless any of you guys have anything in particular you want to throw out there.
No, but I think when we learn, maybe we should try to get Dr. Hurlburt on the show if we can and have a talk with him.
I think it would be fantastic.
Yeah, that'd be fun.
Because there's some things that he's written in his book that really make me go, but what about the things you aren't publishing? And I'll just leave it at that.
All right, we'll get all the juice, all the good, good juicy bits from him live, hopefully.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, that's all I had.
All right. Cool. Thanks, guys. And I guess we will see each other again soon.
Yeah, make sure to like and subscribe and all that stuff.
Yeah, that's what I was forgetting.
Hit the bell.
The bell.
Approximately 88% of our viewers aren't subscribed. So please help the algorithm by hitting that subscribe button.
All right.
Yeah, and leave a comment.
Yes,
we all love to read comments.
Comment to hack the algorithm.
And read every comment.
We
share your pristine experience of this show.
Yeah. What was actually going on in your mind and in your awareness? Even if it was just looking outside at a butterfly. That works too. All right.
All right.
Bye, guys.